The one kind of plan every church needs. Coming up next on the Church Revitalization Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and A.J. Mathieu.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is Scott Ball. I'm joined by my friend and co-host, A.J. Mathieu.
Good day.
A.J., today, our episode is an unintentional follow-up to last week's episode. So I started working on this topic before it kind of dawned on me, this is almost like a sequel. So last week we talked about the problem of aging out pastors and the need for raising up a next generation of leaders and problems with seminary and all that. So it was a really interesting episode and pretty popular. So if you haven't, if you're listening to this and you haven't listened to last week's episode, you don't have to listen to last week's for this week's episode, but you might want to go back and go back and check it out.
It's a companion piece, Scott.
A companion piece. Yeah, not a prerequisite, but a companion. This week we're talking about succession planning. Fun fact, AJ.
Yeah.
This is episode 235 of the Church Revitalization Podcast. And this is the first time we've ever directly tackled the topic of succession planning. It's rare for us to cover a topic that we haven't covered.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Not that we're
completely
recycling
untouched
necessarily, but like a totally untouched topic by us.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of fun, right?
Yeah. If you, listener, can think of a topic that you think is important in the church that we've never covered, send that over. Email it, leadership@malphursgroup.com. We'd love to
hear it. Yeah, for sure. Or if you're like, gosh, I wish these guys would get to this question, this burning I have.
Throw it over.
Yeah.
Absolutely no guarantees that we'll do it.
But we probably will, because we're always looking for ideas. So today we're talking about succession planning. This is, I think, a really important topic and one that we've avoided. Avoided is maybe too strong a word. One that we haven't covered because I would say this is not our primary. It's not in our wheelhouse of core competency. This is not a topic that we're dealing with churches on a regular basis. In our work with churches, we have other people that when this topic comes up, we might pass them off to and say, this would be a better partner for this issue. However, we do touch on this topic a lot just in churches that we work with. We get this question a lot. It's on your minds a lot when we work with folks. So all of that being said, I think it is good for us. We have enough competence in this area and experience in this area to at least cover a podcast's worth of content and advice, I think.
We recognize the need. Yeah. And it's worthy of discussion.
Yeah. So we've got 5 points we're going to walk through today, sort of the biblical basis for succession planning, some benefits of thinking about this early. What are the key elements of a succession plan? Some challenges in succession planning, and then what should the role of the current leader be in succession planning? So those are the kind of the 5 key things we're going to be touching on today. We can maybe dive straight in.
Let's do it.
In. Here we go. Say that again.
I think you've got in here the passage in the book of Numbers, which I think is it's a good early look at kind of a directive even of succession planning in not in the church, in the tabernacle, in the Israelite tabernacle, in which it's actually defined. There's an age defined. The age of 25 is defined, in which the Levite, right? It was priests, right? It was the Levitical priests.
Yeah, let's take a step back, because you just said that Numbers passage. Some people might be like, what Numbers passage?
Oh, I never mentioned it. Numbers 8.
No, Numbers 8.
23 to 26.
26. And how about I just read it really quick?
Okay.
It's not that long.
Great. It
says, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, this applies to the Levites. From 25 years old and upward, they shall come to do duty in the service of the tent of meeting. And from the age of 50 years, they shall withdraw from the duty of the service and serve no more. They minister to their brothers in the tent of meeting by keeping guard, but they shall do no service. Thus you shall do to the Levites in assigning their duties. So we have here, I want to recognize, I don't think anybody is recommending that you retire at age 50.
Pastors should be age 25.
Age 25 to 50.
That's
Yep. That is not the principle we should be extracting here. The principle to extract is that there comes a season where every leader has to recognize that there needs to be a transition. And this is where I would point to last week's episode, where I would say, hey, some of you who've been at this a long time maybe need to start thinking about what the next phase of ministry looks like. And the other thing I want to point out about this passage, AJ, is that the retirement that's there isn't really retirement. It's just a shift in role.
right.
And so they were still involved in the work of the tabernacle, but in a different way. And I think that sometimes we've got guys who don't step down from roles because they're not ready to be done and they don't see themselves as done. And I don't know that you can be. I think until the Lord calls you home, you've got work to do, but your work might need to change. It might need to be different. I think Paul is a good example of this. His role shifted,
Mm.
you know, kind of by forced circumstance when he goes into when he goes into house arrest. He can't be planting churches the way that he was, but he takes on this role of teaching and almost
Mhm.
creating a proto seminary of sorts out of his home, raising up leaders and sending them out. So, um, yeah, your role may shift, but that doesn't mean you're done.
Yeah, well, I mean, this was actually a very natural thing that was happening in early civilization. I mean, from the dawn of creation and the family unit. I mean, this was a natural occurrence. The older generation, they age, their role functions differently, but the next generation was taught,
Mhm.
groomed, ready, prepared to lead. So, I mean, this is not revolutionary things.
No.
It's really
It-
more probably
I
forgotten
was going to
stuff.
say what's novel, what's new in society is that we have people who aren't making this transition.
Yeah, right.
That's for all of human history past. There was always this idea at some point there's going to be this handoff.
Mhm.
What's different is that that's happening less and less.
It really is. Yeah. Now it's like, oh, okay, here's a need. Let's put together some people that can figure out what to do next.
Yeah, that's right.
what's our next step going to be? That you're right, is the novel approach and not
Yeah,
the just natural or biblical way of
right,
handling succession.
right. So, Paul says this to Timothy. I think it's a good way to sort of transition here. But what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach to others also.
Mm.
This has always been the model that
Yeah.
you would take what you know, pass it on to others, and let them take the lead. So there's certainly biblical precedents and historical precedents
Hmm.
for succession planning. So that would be our argument: is that you should be thinking about this, and then maybe that's a good segue to point two, which is what are some of the practical benefits of thinking about succession planning before you need it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, something that is definitely near and dear to our hearts and core to what we do as a ministry, and that is continuity of mission and vision.
Hmm.
I mean, building that into existing leaders, future leaders, is a huge benefit for thinking about succession. And this is just something that we cover very deeply in the work that we do, especially in our strategic envisioning, church health, and revitalization work. Is that doing that planning work ahead of time, understanding what is most important in the church, and having a team and ideally the entire church aware and striving towards the same things makes someone to lead that work easier and more understood. And again, we do this a lot with churches that are have pastors that are retiring or
Hmm.
without pastors,
Hmm.
and we talk about then doing this work, with an elders or ministry leaders in the church as they're seeking their next pastor, which is a disjointed succession plan. It wasn't pre-planned necessarily. But even in the gap period between leaders, having the next leader come in, understanding where the previous leader left off and where the church was headed together, can bring continuity, even though there was a break in the succession, can enable to sort of bridge continuity over in mission and vision. So that's the benefit. Either way, your church will go through this. The question is, are you going to plan for the succession, or are you going to react to the succession? But at some point, you will be in this position.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe a good way of thinking about this and remembering is that that vision for your church really isn't yours. Or it shouldn't be. It should be God's vision
Mm,
for your church and for those people. And it's just who is standing at the head of that and who's the champion of it. I mean, a sort of the clearest biblical example of this is Moses, right? Where you have Moses being the champion of this vision of the people leaving Egypt and going into the promised land,
mhm.
and he's the leader to take them so far. But then you have Joshua who rearticulates this exact same vision in a different
Yeah.
way, but he's the one who actually takes them across the Jordan and into the promised land. And so it's a continuation of the same vision in this handoff from Moses to Joshua, and it ought to be the same way in your own succession planning, that the vision is God's vision, and it's not the vision for you, it's the vision for his people in that
Yeah.
place. So it's about the people going into the promised land and not about the person.
This is a
Um,
common question, Scott, that I'm sure I hear it. I'm sure you do hear it.
yeah.
Is about developing mission and vision, which, there is a differentiation there, but we have plenty of podcast topics on, on defining what
Of
those two
those
mean.
things, yeah, we don't need to deviate
But
there.
but um, but this is often a question: should we do this, or should we have the new pastor have his vision be put in place? Should we be using the old pastor's vision? And this is where there should be continuity. Church should not completely change with every new leader. That, I think, would identify the fact that it's not being led by God and the Holy Spirit and the scriptures, because there should be more continuity than that. You should not see churches fall apart with the changing of leadership. There should have been continuity that would bridge that over and make that, though there will always be bumps in the road, it should have
Yeah.
made that more stable and simple to some extent. Um, so yeah, planning for the future is only a benefit in how is this going to look, and what continues, where do we see continuity from one leader to the next?
Right. So succession planning ensures continuity of vision and mission. It also provides stability during times of transition. So, just having that plan, we'll talk more about this in a minute, but having a plan and knowing the plan and working the plan, um, you know, uh, gives some sense of that this whole thing isn't just totally chaotic and people wondering, well, what's going to happen next? Just
Mhm.
everyone know, hey, this is what we're doing. We're following this process. Um, yeah, it also helps to identify and develop future leaders. So if you are in a situation where you can be thinking about, we'll talk about this in more depth here in just a minute, but if you are in a situation where you're able to take a longer view on succession planning, and not be like, well, I'm going to leave and then they're going to figure out when I'm gone. Um, but it does give you the potential of maybe identifying someone on your current staff or someone who's in your current congregation or some person who's outside of your congregation that you're going to bring in and you're going to build up. There could be any number of options or ways of doing this, but building into that leader, developing that leader over a period of time, like a Joshua who was a commander for what had been one of those chiefs of thousands that we read about in Exodus 18. And so the competence was built up over time so that when it happened, you Moses has no problem passing. Moses has all kinds of regrets about his leadership personally,
Mm,
and things that he wishes he could have done. But he has no reservations at all about
yeah,
passing things off to
that's
Joshua
right.
because,
Joshua had been executing on the vision that God was giving to Moses and Moses was giving to the people.
yeah, that's right. So the handoff there was smooth. Now the
Hmm.
people were still like wanting a sign, you know, So we see this early on in Joshua. The people are like, is God really with this guy the way that he was with Moses? And so that's why we have this holding back of of the Jordan River, because the people knew Moses could stick the staff in the water and that parts the Red Sea. Well, what about this guy? And so God, uh sorry, when this is a total sidetrack, but Joshua puts the ark. God tells Joshua to put the ark, set the ark down of the covenant inside in the Jordan River, and then that holds the waters back. And Joshua is pointing this to this point and saying, "Look, it was never Moses;
Mm,
it was always the presence of God that holds back the waters." Um, and so this is a really cool image there. At any rate, but it was still a sign to the people that okay, this person that has been installed as our leader has the same authority that that Joshua, or I'm sorry, that Moses had. So if you're able to take a longer view, one of the benefits of succession planning is that you can identify and develop a future leader over a longer period of time. So maybe that's a good segue then to the third point, which is what are these key elements of a good successful succession plan?
yeah. Well, first and foremost, who who are we talking about?
Ooh, yeah.
Um, who might we have, or uh, who will we be looking for? Maybe that is probably more common approach is who should we be looking for rather than who do we just have among us. That would probably be a little too closed of a view to assume no matter how big our church is or what the scenario is that are the successor to our current pastor. And if we didn't really mention this, we are kind of talking more
Mainly about
specifically
senior
about
pastor.
a senior pastor succession. Who do we already have within our church that will be our next senior pastor? That probably is a bit of a myopic view of succession planning. Now that person might be in your midst, but
Mm-hmm.
that's the wrong way of probably starting the plan is who do we have and let's work from that rather than who is the ideal, who do we believe would be the best type of leader and the person that would understand who we are as a church and how we move forward. More so, that would probably be the more healthy way of doing this, rather than just like, well, who do we have to choose from? They seem like the best choice.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, identifying first who might be the type of person at least to be the successor.
Yeah, I think you can think of it and I maybe hinted at this already, but maybe three categories. So the first thing we want to start with, and this is something we cover a lot in our leadership pipeline work that we do with churches, is we do want to start with those competencies. So what's the character we're looking for in a candidate, and what's the capacity or skill set that we're looking for in a candidate? Um, and that's the starting point. And then you can layer on top of that other things like alignment with the church's vision and culture and all of those things. So we're starting with sort of skills and character that are requirements for the role, and then we can layer on top of that additional qualifications that we might have. So yeah, we're starting with this standard. This is the kind of the image or the form of the kind of person we're looking for, and then we can look, I think, in three different places. One would be our existing staff, someone who's maybe on the team already, who might be looking for a promotion and is qualified. Another might be another kind of internal candidate, maybe someone who's not already on the staff, but is inside of our orbit in some other way that we could identify and start to cultivate. And in those instances, you're wanting to be sure that if there are any gaps, if you've got a 2-year transition window, that's maybe okay if you feel like they've got the ceiling is high enough that you could begin to cultivate that. Like I'm not afraid of that. If someone's got some gaps, maybe in their character, I'm not big gaps, hopefully, but maybe just some maturing things, or maybe there's some emotional intelligence things you're like, they need to work on that, or how they communicate. Those are some skills and things that you can maybe develop. I'm not necessarily afraid of that. But if we look around and there's no one on our team who is anywhere close, then maybe we need to look in that third category, which would be someone externally.
Mhm.
Now, you can look at someone externally and bring them on early. Um, not as the lead pastor, or you could bring them on, as the successor, and say, hey, this is going to be the successor, but we're going to overlap by a year. There are different models of doing this, and no one of them is correct. But you just need to be clear on what your situation is going to be and what you're going to do. If you're able to find, I do think if you're able to find AJ a candidate internally, um, that that is qualified. So assuming that they're qualified, like I would not like, I don't know that I would shoehorn in an internal candidate just because they're internal. But if you had someone who was qualified and they are an internal candidate, sometimes that's a good thing
Yeah.
because they already have relationships, they already have an understanding of the church's culture, they've got some organizational sort of background and history, they um, understand the culture of the area where the church is. There, I mean,
Yeah.
certainly there's some benefits to being already in the group,
Yeah.
um, assuming that they're qualified. But you got to start with those qualifications first.
Yeah, right, right. Which, I mean, another one of the points here in that we're talking about on the key elements of a succession plan is establishing a timeline for the transition. So,
Right.
again, thinking the earlier you think about this, the more opportunity you do have for a potential internal person to become prepared to take the role. So, depending on how fast your timeline is, or if you're having to do this in emergency mode, the internal person who's not quite ready, this may not come for them at all then. Um, but starting the process earlier, you have more opportunity to train people up.
Yeah, and I know that this is maybe an issue that if you're listening to this, you're like, well, here's my struggle. I'm afraid that I'm going to become a lame duck the second the word succession plan comes out of my mouth.
Mm,
And I don't want to disregard that fear at all. And instead I want to maybe give you some ways to mitigate that. Um, one would be if you can start talking about succession planning irrationally early and go, hey, I am decades away. I'm 5, 10 years away from even considering retiring or moving away. But I think it would be wise for us to start thinking through how we want to do succession when the time comes. So if you know that you are irrationally away from succession, then you can have kind of an objective discussion about it. That'd be one thing. The second thing, if you actually are getting closer to needing to execute a succession plan, and so you're delaying it though, you can simply hopefully you have uh, an elder team or a deacon team that you trust that's small enough that you can trust and say, hey, I want to start working on a succession plan, but I don't want to communicate this to the congregation because the second you can communicate it broadly, that is when you become a lame duck. And so I would not say anything to the congregation until you know what that handoff is going to be. It can be a 1 year runway where there's going to be a handoff overlap by a year or 6 months or whatever it is. But just know that people are going to start thinking like, when is this guy leaving? I
hmm
worked with the church a number of years ago where this was the case. He had announced that he was leaving like 2 years before he was planning on actually leaving. And within 6 months, people were like, who's his replacement going to be? And they hadn't put any thought into who was going to be his replacement, and they hadn't put a succession plan, but he had announced it before they had a plan. And that is a mistake. So hopefully you can have a small enough group that you can trust, that you can develop a plan with and keep it very internal, and then only announce it to the congregation when you are ready to become that lame duck, because that will happen.
Well, there certainly are going to be constitutional questions, structural questions that who has, in what scenario in which would that even be able to happen? Like here, this person will be your next pastor. You just telling the church that. I mean, a lot of churches are going to require some kind of a vote. That's going to,
Yeah, for sure.
uh, so at what point would that happen? Are we voting this person in a year before they become the person? Or are we, how does this whole
Yeah,
thing
you don't want
play
to bait
out?
and switch anybody where you're going, okay, we're hiring on associate pastor Jim, and then it's like, surprise, Jim's the new guy. Yeah, no, no, no. You want to be clear.
Yeah,
Y- The, the point of communication is to build trust. Um, the only point I'm trying to make is be thoughtful about what you say and when you say it, because you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. So
yeah,
once you say certain things, you can't unsay them.
that's right. And it's not deceitful to be thinking about succession in your mind as a senior leader and not speaking the word succession. I think it's healthy and good leadership style and culture. You mentioned this, Scott, to always be referring to yourself, your position as one who is here temporarily. It's Christ's church. I'm here for a season, and we should, as a church, be raising up leaders, some with other functionality than
Yeah.
others, who have the ability and could step into this position. I think if you build a culture in the church of everybody seeing that position as being that way, and having other leaders who are visible, and participate in senior level leadership activities, then I think that is just really makes these things easier. Scott, one of our friends, a pastor in Europe, is going through a succession right now, and this has been something that him as a leader, I think, is going to become helpful for their church because they've got an associate who's very visible, preaches very frequently, participates in similar things as the senior pastor, and that is making a succession, I think, in any scenario like that, a little softer. Whereas we've got somebody who can provide the continuity. We know this person. It's not just somebody out of left field all of a sudden that is stepping into things.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. So I think that maybe I'm always maybe a little bit hesitant to use this analogy because I don't want to come across in any way as insulting. But I think a good way to think about congregational communication is to think about when you're communicating something to your kids, like a big decision to your kids. Like, for example, if you were, now your kids are older, but my kids are younger. So if we were going to be moving, if we were selling our house and we were moving, um, like what would I communicate about that change to my kids? Would I talk about here's how much equity we have in the house, and so we're able to put this much money towards the new house, and here's why we picked this house over this house. I don't know that here's the name of our realtor. Like I don't know that I would get into all that, or hey, we're closing on this date because the house is going to be in escrow. Like here's you know what I'm saying? Like there are all these kinds of details that I just wouldn't tell my kids. So it's we're not trying to hide things from our kids. Any
Mhm.
question that my kids would ask about a move or something, I would tell them. Um, but when you volunteer too much information, you run the risk of just confusing them or causing anxiety or overwhelming them, or they just simply don't understand. So, because they don't have all of the context in order to be able to understand it. And I think the same is true when it comes to leadership. It isn't that the people in your congregation are stupid or childish. That's not it. But sometimes when they aren't in the room having all of the background information and all of the context, when we start to volunteer too much information divorced from all of the context that informed the decisions, the, people can get anxious and confused or frustrated, or actually promotes more disagreement. So just be cautious as you're building your succession plan. Part of that communication plan is, what are we going to communicate? When are we going to communicate? How do we be sure that we give good, clear, transparent communication without overwhelming people with the amount of information?
Yeah.
But of course, everything is open, and anybody who wants to know more can schedule a meeting with you or schedule a meeting with an elder to get more information. So I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting that you be manipulative in any way. Um, but only to be thoughtful about what you communicate, particularly from the stage, so that you don't overwhelm people or
Yeah.
cause undue sort of anxiety, so to speak.
I mean, you're describing normal good leadership practices to this specific idea, scenario of succession.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
would
We
do this
talked about this
normally
in Leaders
anyway. This is how
Pipeline
you would
too.
handle big decisions in the church.
Well, you would hope. But we've seen a lot of bad communication
That's
in
true.
church.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
All
Okay.
right.
So
Challenges in
hold on,
succession.
just to maybe just because this is, I think, point three is maybe the most significant. I just want to be sure that we're really clear. The elements of a successful succession plan are going to be understanding who the potential successor is. You can look internally, either at a current staff member or someone else who's internal, or you could look externally. If you have the ability to identify the successor early, then you can begin to on ramp them and kind of fill in any gaps that they may have in terms of their skills or experiences. You want to uh, create some specific, we didn't talk about this actually, but we want to create some specific duties and expectations for the outgoing and incoming leaders. So, like, if there is a transition, if there is an overlap, who's going to be preaching? Is it going to
Mhm.
be 100% and 100%? Is there going to be some sort of a smooth transition? Um, uh, what's happening there? Those kinds of things. And then you want to create a timeline that you first manage internally and then communicate externally, and then finally be sure that you create a communication plan for the congregation that doesn't overshare, but is transparent and builds trust.
Yeah, absolutely. There will still be challenges. Your
Yes.
no succession plan goes off without a hitch or pushback. And so first, addressing resistance to change. You're it is 100% guaranteed there will be people who, it's going to be a difficult transition for them. But how you address their resistance to change, and it's probably the same people that have given you resistance to other changes prior to this, um, is it's going to make a difference in how they understand the need, how they understand how hopefully well qualified the new person might be, how well vetted they are, how much trust is being put into them by the senior level leadership of the church. All of these things will be necessary components in addressing resistance to change that will inevitably come up. So that's certainly one of the first challenges will be people saying, "Wait, I don't know if I'm comfortable with this." Um, and probably lots of questions. Have you thought of this? What's their view on this? How would they handle this scenario? Because people will throw a million hypothetical scenarios.
Mhm.
All of these will be elements around resistance to a change that is significant.
Yeah, I think one of the things we're trying to avoid, this happens sometimes with churches that have had a pastor for 20 or more years, is the guy after him is the sacrificial lamb
Mm.
leader, the one who comes in to just sort of
The rebound, Pastor.
the rebound pastor. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be that way um, at all. And some of that has to just do with how do we deal with resistance to change? And you can actually have the other extreme situation. A church I was working with once was going through a transition, and they were looking at candidates for their new pastor, and they were totally about to hire. They really liked this guy who was 100% a rebound pastor. He was like the complete opposite of the previous pastor. And I strongly urged them, do not hire this person. There was nothing wrong with him, like morally or anything like that, but I could just tell him, like, he's not going to stay because he's not going to fit. This is not a fit. This is not, do not hire this person. He is not a fit. And I'm so thankful that they listened to me. They ended up hiring someone who he's still there. And that was 7 years ago, something like that. He's still there. And he's still leading faithfully because they didn't hire the rebound guy. This guy they
Mhm.
ended up hiring is a much better fit culturally for them.
Well,
So
really, the rebound pastor becomes the succession plan. They didn't plan the churches that
right,
don't plan ahead.
yeah,
They make a reactive decision, and that becomes the timeline in which they discover then what they're really looking for. Unfortunately, it comes at the expense of someone's life. You know,
right,
not their
yeah.
life,
Well, because
the
they
time of someone's life putting into that.
right, I think that um, the rebound pastor can fall into one of two categories. They are either a person who is the church hired because they thought that this person was a clone of the
Hmm.
previous person, and then turns out there's no such thing,
Yeah, they can't
and
be. They
they're
can't
going
live
to be
up
a
to that.
disappointment, or they're the complete opposite of that person
Yeah.
because there was something about the previous person they were ready to really move on from. So they were, in the instance I was just talking about, it was that was the thing. It was the complete opposite of who the previous pastor had been. And it was so clear to me that that's what it was. I'm like, oh, just all of the things that annoyed you about the guy who had been there for 30 years, you just went and found a person who was on the opposite end of the spectrum on all
Mm.
of those things. That is not thoughtful. That's just reaction.
Yeah.
And I can see why he's appealing to you, but think about the vision. We were working on strategic envisioning with him. Like, look at the vision of where we're going. Do you see how this person doesn't fit with where the church is going? So, anyways, so just be thoughtful. That is a challenge. Yes,
Yeah.
people react to change in different ways. Either they want to totally rebound, or they want to, just avoid it entirely.
Yeah. Yeah. There's going to be generational differences in a succession plan as well. And especially probably the pastor that has been there a long time, the pastor has aged with the congregation. That's a different scenario than the church that has maybe a broad generational spectrum in it. The pastor is, midlife and making a change. So different generations in the church are going to process the change differently and
Yep,
react differently.
totally. And what we're always hoping for in a situation like this is that you you're hoping that you're bringing someone on, and you should be looking for someone who has some emotional intelligence, who isn't just like, I'm the new young hip thing coming in being
Mm.
hired, and
Mhm.
I'm gonna that's so outdated and old
Yeah,
fashioned. You
being tone deaf to the culture of the church.
right.
Mhm.
You want them to have the freedom to be able to lead and to
Mhm.
make changes when necessary, but you would hope that you wouldn't be hiring a person who wouldn't come in with sort of an attitude, a lack of humility,
Yeah.
as if he's got nothing to learn, you know.
Yeah. Well,
So
that's a perfect segue into kind of the next point, and that's balancing new perspective with history and culture and process and even
mhm,
momentum towards the vision, that new person is now leading into. um, Understanding where the church has come from, how they make decisions, the way the various people in the church think and process things. This is all a balance, and it's never going to be perfectly smooth. But thinking about these things ahead of time and being prepared for these navigational bumps is going to be a better place by which to overcome.
yeah, it's Chesterton's fence, right? We've talked
Chesterton's
about this.
fence.
Chesterton's fence.
Okay,
Okay.
go ahead.
All
What
right.
is Chesterton's fence?
It's the idea that two people could be walking along a road or in a field and encounter a fence, right? In the middle of this field.
Okay.
And one person's reaction to that could be, we should we should take down this fence. It's in the middle of it's in the way. We should just take this fence away. Another reaction would be, we shouldn't take the fence down until we know why the fence is here in the first place,
Hmm.
right? And sort of some wisdom, I think, in going, as a younger leader, as someone who's stepping into a role, something that might seem to you to be just like organizational creep or mission creep or something that might seem arbitrary to you in some way might really be significant.
Mhm.
And you may not discover the importance of that thing until you destroy it. And then you go,
Mm.
oh, now I know why that thing was here.
Yeah.
Um, this is something that I feel like I've learned more and more, even at the Malthus group. There are some things that I've joked about this with you. Like there's things we used to do when I first joined the team in 20, when was that? 2015, 2016, something like that. And I was like, in early days, 2016, 2017, 2018, I'd be like, we should not do this. And it's funny because there are things that we do now that we had gotten rid of, and now we do them again. We've kind of rebounded and come back to them. We're like, oh, that's why this thing was here. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Uh, and so maybe that's just a good piece of advice. If you're the successor, maybe don't remove the fence until you know why the fence was there.
That is wise words, no doubt. Yeah. Um, yeah, and unexpected transitions. So succession planning is good for any scenario, but sometimes things happen faster than you would have expected. And I guess this is also just, a word of caution. You just never know. You never know what tomorrow brings. And so, well, Scott, you and I worked with the church in the last year or so that now has a pastor leaving, and it came up very suddenly for them. You know, taking a new role somewhere else and heading out. And we know there was no succession plan in place. Um,
Yeah.
and in fact, the leadership culture of the church, was not conducive to that even happening. It was,
No,
you know,
there's a
yeah,
real vacuum in that church
very
right
much a leadership vacuum, a very top down thing. And now, with the announcement of the departure that did not have a big ramp up,
what, a
left
month,
them,
2 months, something like
yeah,
that.
has left them really, I mean, very quickly having to react. Like, oh my gosh, how does the church work day to day? I mean, who is responsible for things? What is going to be the process going forward? Who's going to be preaching? You can imagine the questions being asked. So there's certainly a cautionary tale about not planning at all for the future, and then at least having been thinking about it, and put a few things in place, because as I said, yeah, illness happens, death happens, opportunities happen. There's all kinds of things that could make a significant change in your church tomorrow, literally, and so thinking about these things. Even, I mean, a better than nothing succession plan is that, well, that there would be at least some core leaders, some kind of a decision making body in the church that would at least know, you know what, if something happened for the first 60 days, we know who's going to be able to get up and preach, who's going to be the point person that will address the congregation amongst us,
Yeah.
our spokesperson who is going to be responsible for providing, like, I don't know, the Facebook updates or the email update or these kinds of things. This is, like emergency preparedness. This is what cities work on. Even
Yeah.
families sometimes have got, hey, if something happens, kids, we're going to meet by the big tree over there in the front yard. Okay.
Right.
Some of this is very basic and it's often overlooked and not really thought
You're
about.
saying it's basic, but most churches don't have an emergency succession plan.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it could happen. I know we'd all like to think that that wouldn't happen, but um, who is it? Is it's been said, like, you like to think, well, a moral failure wouldn't happen. You don't know that. I
Mm.
think, I don't know who said it, but someone once said every man is 2 drinks and a wink away from a bad decision. Um,
Probably not every pastor, but that has
the
happened as well.
Presbyterians.
So
I don't, no, no, no. I think that that's the attitude we should all have. I mean,
yeah.
you would like to hope that your character is stronger than that, right?
Well, yeah. How many churches have thought, yeah, our pastor is kind of on the border of a moral failure? So we've been planning for
I'm
that.
not
No
saying
one
that. I
has
mean,
ever expected that. So
no one's ever expected that. I'm
yeah,
saying, as a man, your attitude should be, I'm 2 drinks and a wink away from a mistake. Like that's, and in light of that, you might take more precautions to I'm not saying that everyone's morals are that weak. Am I
Yeah.
digging myself a hole?
No, no,
I'm
no.
I'm
I'm
simply
actually kind of supporting your point. No church
okay.
has ever thought our pastor could have a moral failure, so we're going to prepare for that. It will always be a surprise when it happens. Now, you might, in hindsight, look back and go, he did some kind of
There were
shady
some
stuff
red
that we
flags.
really overlooked.
Yeah.
But
But
it's always going
as
to
a
be a shock.
man, you should always be like, I'm way weaker. You're way weaker. If you're a man, you're listening to this, trust me, you are way weaker than you think you are. Right?
Yeah.
If it can happen to David, it can happen to you. And I
Mhm.
haven't written nearly as many Psalms as that guy has. So, um, so it's not above any of us to make those kinds of mistakes.
Yeah.
And if you make that kind of mistake, it would be understandable that your church then wouldn't employ you anymore.
Hmm.
And so the church needs a plan. You could have a heart attack, so and die. You, or you could get a great opportunity. Like something could come up, and you're like, I can't pass this up. It's better for my family. The Lord's leading me in this direction. I got to take this. You need a plan. So have an emergency succession plan in place. The church that you're referencing, we won't name it, but listen, I mean, they don't have an associate pastor who's going to step up into that role even in an interim basis. They don't have an elder board. They got nothing,
Hmm.
nothing, and they are scrambling. And it's I mean, I don't, not to speak ill of the people leaving, and he didn't die. He moved to a different opportunity, but it's kind of his fault. Like, and I would like to say, if you're the senior leader and you're going, well, my church doesn't have anything, it's on you. It's on
Hmm.
you to
Hmm.
start that conversation
Hmm.
and say, we need to have a plan for this. I want to give kudos to, if he happens to be listening, this coming weekend, I'm doing a board retreat with a church in Alabama, and it was prompted by the pastor. Now we're not just working on succession plans, but that's one of the things we're talking about and he said in a meeting that we had last week, he said, look, none of us is here forever. We need good systems in place so this leadership knows how to operate. If something were ever to happen to me, it can't all be hinging on my own leadership skill to keep this thing moving forward. We need good practices in place. And that's the way to think about this.
Yeah, and that's a good segue to our last point here on the role of the current leader in succession planning, to try to work towards a conclusion on Scott. Maybe the longest episode we've ever done. I don't know. It seems like we've been talking
I don't
all
know.
day.
You listeners don't know this. There was a little bit of a pause because there was a somewhat of a major spill on AJ's desk. So
I
I'm
had
not sure
not
how long
planned
this
for
episode.
spilling water on my desk and us having to pause. Maybe that's why I feel like this is the longest episode ever. But
Yeah.
yeah, so the current role, the role of the current pastor or leader in the church, it is huge and vital to how this is going to go down.
Well,
And
let me say this. Can I just, so that we don't make this really long, let me
yeah,
encourage you to read the whole article. There's more in here, but
yeah,
I can sum up the role of this person who is leaving
you're
in
going to be the
two.
concise one between the two of us. Go
Yes, I
ahead.
am.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes. Shut your mouth. Number one, humility.
Oh
Just
yeah.
have humility. Embrace the process, embrace the new person.
Mm,
There are horror stories about pastors who couldn't let go
mhm,
and they ended up coming back. It caused
mhm.
division, all kinds of things. So just have humility and
Yeah.
support the person. And supporting that person might mean you have to leave the church. Like if you're retiring, but you want to keep going to the church, leave for a season, go away for 6 to 9 months, and then come back. But just have humility. And then the other thing that I would say is really important in this, your role is to start thinking about your own future. Like the church needs a vision for where it's going, and you need a vision for where you're going. If all you have ahead of you is looking back on what you did, that's not a plan. What's the next phase of your ministry going to be? Whether you're moving on to another opportunity or another kind of phase of life, you need more than a vision of sitting on a beach with a drink that has an umbrella in it. You can only do that for so many weeks before you get bored. So, what's your plan? So be humble and you make a plan for what's next in your future.
Amen. That's what needs to happen. Conclusion. Make a succession plan. I mean, this is, I would hope by now, if you're still listening, that we've driven home the point that
Why wouldn't they be listening, AJ? Come on.
waiting to do this is not the right move. Get
No.
started sooner than later. This has been episode 235 of the Church Revitalization Podcast. So the article is at malfordsgroup.com/235.
Believe it or not, there's more content in there than we've covered in this episode. It's a long article.
So yes, go spend some time over there. We've got the YouTube link over there if you would like to see the silliness ensue.
You
and not
can't see
just
the
listen
spill
to it.
happen though, which is a real bummer.
That's true. We edited out the spill. Hey, while you're at malfordsgroup.com, we've got a donate option there. Why? Because we're a nonprofit ministry doing work all around the world with churches. Coming up soon, you're listening to this as it comes out at the very beginning of the month of April. Got a trip to Germany to work one-on-one with the church there this month, and next month one-on-one with the church in Thailand. These are they're the next two upcoming trips, both unfunded as of yet. We need your support to make that happen. And we're trusting that the Lord will come through with those funds for that. So consider that, pray about it, either as a mission partner for your church or you just individually. And if you'd like to learn more about that, you can email us always, leadership@malfordsgroup.com. We've got other projects coming up this year in some African countries, South America, more in Europe. There's a lot happening, and if there's a particular part of the world you feel called to support, then we'd love to have a conversation with you. We probably have something in the general region that we're trying to get funded. We love that you guys are listening and hopefully still are on this long episode. We'll be back with you again next week. Thanks for being here.